you think about protein bars and some of these things, and people have to think about why they're using it. Is a protein bar in the middle of the afternoon better than having a donut? Absolutely. So we know that the amount of protein that was actually going to help muscle health is probably in the 35-gram range. There's very few bars to get anywhere near that.
Hey, everybody. We've had some of the most incredible guests coming to you these past couple of months. The amount of expertise and knowledge on these cutting edge topics is something we really hope that you enjoy. And if you do, it would make a huge difference to us if you could rate, review, and subscribe the podcast. It helps us to get more guests, better experts, and talk about all of the things that are really important to you. So give us a love, give us a lot of love, and don't forget to subscribe so you get all our new episodes.
Guys, I want to introduce our guest today. We have Dr. Donald Layman is a professor in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at the University of Illinois and is a distinguished fellow of the American Society for Nutrition. Dr. Layman earned his doctorate in human nutrition and biochemistry and is internationally recognized for his research on protein and amino acids for muscle health. He is the protein guy. He has spent the last 30 years investigating the role of protein in muscle-centric health and has over 120 peer-reviewed research publications on the topic. He is here to talk to you about the role of protein and amino acids in your diet in language that you can understand, and leave today's podcast with some usable data from the protein guy, and how to make protein work for you in your life. So tune in. I hope you love this episode as much as I did. I learned a lot, and we'll be implementing that into my daily diet. Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Thick Thighs Save Lives podcast. I'm Kelsey, and I have an excellent expert for you guys today. And what you need to know is he has spent the last 30 years investigating the role of protein for muscle-centric health and has over 120 peer-reviewed research publications on this topic. So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Layman to the show.
Great to be with you, Kelsey. I
Yeah.
love the name of your podcast, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. We came up with it years ago, but it's really, withstood the test of time, for sure. And you are the guy when it comes to protein and being the expert. You are the expert. So I know this is very hot in the health and wellness space right now. So I really want to hopefully set the record straight for a lot of our listeners with how much they should focus on protein, and what role it should play as a macronutrient. So with all the research going on right now into the effects of protein, can you convince our listeners who aren't on their protein train of its importance and why it's getting so much hype right now?
Well, I think it's getting a lot of hype now because we've neglected it for the past 50 years. We've had this attitude that health is all about avoiding fat and cholesterol, and you should eat lots of carbs and grains, and we've clearly gotten massive problems with obesity and diabetes. All of the anti-fat rhetoric hasn't corrected heart disease. We have 40 million people taking statins. So basically the theories that we got in the 1980s haven't worked. And so I think people are looking for other explanations. And as we've gotten into aging and thinking about sarcopenia and muscle health, as we've looked at weight loss and the importance of protein and protecting lean body mass during weight loss, protecting your resting energy expenditure, I think people have just realized we've neglected it. So I'm a protein expert. I think there's a lot of people eating more protein than they probably need, but I think we've also neglected it enormously. So, I think it's time to refocus on it. And to your question, I think we need to go into what should people target? How do they figure it out?
Yeah, Exactly. So I know you said a lot of people are eating too much protein. So is there a number we should aim for? Does this
Yeah,
vary for women, men?
let me correct that. I think people are eating more protein than they would have to have. You know, what's too much? You know, part of the discussion of what's too much is what else should I eat instead? You know, am I better off eating more protein and less carbs? That's probably true for a lot of people. So the question is, how do I balance the macronutrients? So I think we need is there such a thing as too much protein? I think the answer to that is no. So then the question is, how do you balance it?
Mm-hmm. So is there a number we should be shooting for? Like how much is enough?
Yeah, I think that what we know is that there's a big range that people can adapt to. There's a minimum amount, which we call the RDA, which is zero point 0.8 grams per kg, which is around 0.35 grams per pound. And then there's an upper limit of some sort, which we don't have a good number. A lot of the research suggests it's probably perfectly safe up to 3 grams per kg. Uh, I usually use something like a gram per pound as an upper limit when I think about it. So that's really a big range. Where should people be? Well, now we get into the nuances of it. It relates to the quality of the protein you eat. It relates to your age. It relates to your physical activity. It relates to your body composition. So the idea that there's one number for everyone's kind of not very true. To simplify all that, I think people should be around zero point 0.7, 0.75 grams per pound. So that's about 1.5 grams per kg. So for me, that's kind of the target I always use. And people can go above or below that number based on those four things I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And when you say age in there too, as a just generally, should we be taking in more protein as we age, or how is that going to play a factor?
Exactly. I think that's a great question. I think that's what we've kind of learned in the last 20 years is that all of us have a basic rate of protein turnover. You and I, 16-year-old, 65-year-old, we all have to make about 250 to 300 grams of protein in our body every day just to replace and repair our body's muscles, our organs, etc. Um, when we're 25, we do that pretty efficiently. But as we get older, that efficiency goes down. And the term that we've given it is anabolic resistance. And so we know that to get the same level of protein turnover as we get older, we need more protein or at least higher quality protein. And that gets complicated because as we get older, our need for calories also goes down. We lose about 100 calories per decade. So when you're going from your 20s to your 60s, you have to get at least the same amount of protein and probably more in 400 less calories per day. So the focus on protein certainly needs to get higher, and you need to be more careful with it as you get older.
Yeah, because there's only a certain amount that we're going to
Yeah.
be taking in, and we have to prioritize how we're going to metabolically use that the
Yeah,
best.
I mean we have a certain amount of calories, you know, depending on your physical activity and things that you can burn, and yet your need for vitamins and minerals and proteins, particularly essential amino acid, stays the same. So you're having to get higher and higher quality diet the older you get to sort of keep 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 steady, stay healthy.
Now, one of the most common questions along the same lines that I get from my community is when. When is the most important time to take in protein? You know, there's a lot of nuances when it comes to when is there a time of day that it's the most efficient for me, for my body to be able to use it? Do we have like an ideal time, the best time that people should focus on taking in certain amounts of protein?
I I think that's a great question and one that's a lot of confusion out there. And frankly, my research is kind of at the base of the confusion. What we found was that in older individuals, it appears that meal distribution makes a lot of sense. But I want to start that conversation by saying that if you're talking about a 16-year-old or a 25-year-old, there isn't any evidence that meal distribution makes any difference. Okay, so it's protein per day. And if you're in that age range, I think, everybody should be somewhere around 1 gram per kg. I think the minimum, RDA is too low. It's important to recognize that that minimum RDA was really developed primarily with 25-year-old males who were physically active, ideal body weight, and consuming 100% dairy protein during the experiment. And so, as you get into real life, you have to recognize that's a really low number, and it doesn't apply very well to older adults. Back to the meal distribution, what we know is that the most sensitive meal to protein is the one when you come out of the overnight fast. So we know that your body is in a negative or a catabolic condition. And we think that the sooner you get out of that, particularly if you're under any kind of stress, if you're trying to lose weight, if you're bed rest, if you're just simply not very physically active, we think correcting that nighttime catabolic period is critical. We also think that higher protein, lower carbohydrates important at that meal because it helps your body to keep burning body fat. So we think the worst of all worlds is having a low protein, high carbohydrate diet for breakfast, which is what a lot of Americans do. We think that that meal distribution of higher protein, lower carbohydrate at that meal is important. Interestingly, one of the things that has never been studied is the level of protein at a middle meal. How important is protein at lunch? Frankly, nobody's ever studied it. So we have super good data that protein at that first meal is important. And I call it the first meal versus breakfast because it really is whenever you eat it. Whether it's 7 in the morning or 11 in the morning, it's still the first meal. So we think that one's really important. There's some pretty decent data about dinner being effective, but there's, to my knowledge, not a single study that's ever been done on lunch. So I usually say that I think people need to focus on the first meal. Dinner kind of takes care of itself. And then it's protein per day that becomes important. And how much is at the lunch meal? If you're a diabetic and you're trying to balance carbohydrates through the day, I think the balance becomes important. But if you're a normal person, normal weight, I frequently have a fairly low protein lunch. I will try and have 40 grams at my first meal, maybe 15 to 20 at lunch, and then probably close to 60 at dinner time. So I have a very cycling type of protein distribution.
Now, just for our listeners, so they can get kind of a gauge on what is an example of what 40 grams of protein would look like for your first meal.
So in a first meal, so 40 grams of protein for me. The two kinds of breakfast I usually do is one, which is pretty straightforward, which is a protein shake. So I would start out with 20 grams of whey protein. I would mix it with a yogurt and a little bit of milk for fluid. I'd add in some kind of berries, typically blueberries, some ice to keep it cold, and I blend it. So, I have a 40-gram protein mix out of that that is all high quality protein, high essential amino acid level, and it's around 300 calories or so. The other breakfast I will do would be egg-based, and it'll be a combination of eggs and meat and cheese, maybe with a little bit of a, toast or something, or vegetables added to it. And if I'm needing any additional protein, if I don't get to my 40 number, I'll add milk along with it. For me, we always find milk is a good buffer. It's 1 gram per ounce. So you can say, well, I need 4 more grams or I need 8 more grams. or 10 more grams and you drink it as milk. So anyway, so my two breakfasts sort of go that way. One is eggs and meats and cheese, kind of traditional. If I have a little more time, if I'm a little less time, I go with a shake.
Now, that's overall daily timing for how our protein intake is going to be. Is there a sweet spot when it comes to our workouts? So, a lot of our community is hitting the gym and they're thinking like, what they've been told is you need to take in a certain amount of protein in 30 minutes post workout. Then there's a lot that's saying like you're taking in your protein prior to your workout. So I think our community is a little bit mixed up on how
Yeah.
important protein intake should be surrounding a workout. And does that vary with the type of workout that you're doing?
Yeah, I understand why people are confused because the statements in the literature are pretty confused. So let's make it let's make it as simple as possible. I think there's essentially no evidence for protein ahead of workouts. Okay. Uh, I think that if you're talking about a workout, a competition, I think a normal meal ahead of it, 2 hours or so, fine, have protein, especially if you're an athlete. You need protein ahead of time just for satiety and how you feel and your energy. But is there a magic issue of taking a shake 30 minutes before? There's none. There's no evidence to back that up. Protein afterwards, we're guilty again for sort of starting that. Um, we sort of looked at all of the protein research using exhaustive exercise. But what's important is all of that research is in untrained individuals who do exhaustive research, exhaustive exercise to total exhaustion. So, is there a merit to that? Is there evidence that protein right after that kind of resistance exercise or exhaustive exercise? Yeah, but it only works if you're untrained. So if you're doing routine exercise, you're trained, basically this is what I do 3 or 4 times a week, taking protein as you go out of the gym will have no effect at all. So whenever your next meal is, presumably in 2 hours or 3 hours, that's fine. The effect of routine training on the anabolic effect in muscle seems to last at least 24 hours and probably 48 hours. So as long as you're eating in the next 2 days, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when your next protein meal is. So, if you like taking in protein right after your exercise, there's nothing wrong with it. But thinking that's going to somehow maximize your resistance training, there's no data to back that up.
Thank you for clearing that up. I think a lot of our community has felt the pressure and just, a lot of like, am I going to maximize my muscle growth or maintaining muscle mass if I don't get protein 30 minutes prior at post workout? That creates a lot of stress on like what,
Yeah.
30
Right.
minutes after, sometimes that's my drive home
Yeah.
from the gym.
Yeah, I'm the person who first published the protein after exercise, and I have never once taken a protein shake in after my exercise. Never once.
Quick interruption, guys. We are always talking about the importance of community to help you along your journey, to keep you motivated, to surround you with like-minded people. And we have a massive, massive community to do just that. If you haven't already, get in our fitness group on Facebook, Fitness Programming by CVG. Get on our app, CVG Nation. We've got hundreds of thousands of women on there who are just waiting to cheer you on. And we cannot wait to meet you. Get with us on our channels. We love to see you there.
Now that, that kind of leads me to the quality of protein that we're kind of looking at for our meals, or the quality of protein that we're going to take in on a 24-hour span. What are some of our like best higher quality proteins, and what are some of the ones that are like, that's not that important, or try to avoid?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to look at it in two ways. So the way you just asked the question, clearly all the animal proteins are more balanced in terms of essential amino acids than the plant proteins. Plant proteins don't have amino acids for humans. They have it for the plant structures. They have it to build roots and leaves and flowers, which are pretty different than hearts and livers and muscles. And so it's just not the same balance. And plants tend to have more non-essential amino acids, where animal protein have more essential amino acids. So one of the amino acids that we're most interested in for skeletal muscle is the amino acid leucine. And the protein that probably has the best leucine profile is whey protein, so dairy proteins. But dairy protein and eggs are always given credit for being sort of the best of the animal proteins. But meat proteins and, uh, beef and chicken, and I also include fish. They all have a very good amino acid profile, and they're basically the same. Whether it's salmon or whether it's sirloin beef, the amino acid profile is essentially the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are equal in that sense. Um, Beef is particularly interesting because it has very high nutrient value for its calories. You can get a lot of vitamins and minerals, all in very high bioavailable form from red meat. Chicken is a great protein source, but it's actually a very poor nutrient source. White meat has almost no vitamins and minerals in it. That's why it's white. And, so people kind of go back and forth on that. White, very white, flaky fish has relatively low nutrient value too. So salmon, a darker, steakier fish.
Mm-hmm.
When you get into plants, then you get into, they all have lower quality. The legumes tend to be the best of the plant quality. We can get into specific differences. And then you get into things like nuts and some of the grains. Grains are probably the worst in general. Wheat, which is important because it makes up 80% of the plant-based protein in the American diet. 80% of the plant-based protein in the American diet comes from wheat, and wheat is limiting or deficient in 5 essential amino acids. And so people need to recognize that breads and pasta and pizza crust are very poor sources of protein. And yet that's where most of our plant-based protein comes from.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about some of those like protein pack bars or snacks that are kind of marketed towards having like these like high protein snacks that are kind of more on the processed side of protein intake?
Yeah, so 2 parts to that. One is, what is the amino acid value? What is the protein in it? A lot of the bars are made out of soy protein, um, and that's because it's more stable in a bar form.
Mm-hmm.
Protein is what we call hygroscopic, and it draws water to it. So a protein bar has a tendency to get dry and leathery. Uh, Soy, they've sort of learned how to make it into a crisp type of thing, and so the bar stays more crunchy. So there's merit to that. What you have to really start thinking about is, well, how much protein's there? And your comment, ultra processed, just how many ingredients are there, and how many of those ingredients are healthy for you? So I don't use a lot of bars. In fact, I use almost none. You have to kind of decide what you're using them for. I'm a big fan of real foods and unprocessed foods.
Yeah, same. I get the questions from my community a lot of how they can fit some of their protein into their diet when they're on the go and when they don't have access to some of the whole foods that ideally they're looking for. Um, and I think you brought up a really great point about what it's lacking in some of the amino acids. Would you mind giving like someone who doesn't know anything about the nutrients and amino acids that they're able to get from protein, like the quick and dirty of like,
Sure.
why is that important?
Um, is your question about the essential amino acids or other
Yes,
nutrients with it?
the
The
essential
essential.
amino acids. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are 9 what we call essential or indispensable amino acids that you have to have in your diet basically every day. Um, Of those nine, some of them seem to be a bit more important. I mentioned leucine a bit ago. That's very important for muscle protein synthesis. It's kind of a signal from the for the body. Um, Methionine is another one. Lysine is another one. I think threonine is going to get a lot more attention. Tryptophan, and we can talk about those. Methionine, for example, is very important in the body because it produces glutathione, which is an antioxidant, anti-cancer, anti-inflammation. Threonine primarily produces the mucin in your gut lining. We hear a lot about gut health. The amount of threonine in your diet determines how thick your mucin layer is. Um, Phenylalanine tyrosine determines dopamine, which relates to cognitive function. Tryptophan produces serotonin, relates to mood and sleep. And so as you go through the amino acids, just like a vitamin has multiple functions. I mean, um, vitamin A, for example, we know is important in growth, it's important in vision, it's important in immune function. We don't just determine how much we need based on growth. I mean, how much growing does an adult do? Not. But we look at so just like that for amino acids, they all have a role in protein synthesis. You know, freshman nutrition, we teach about building blocks, but they all have these other metabolic roles. And that's where all of the balance of protein comes in. You have to have the right balance. And a lot of people will talk about, well, it's based on nitrogen balance. Well, what health outcome does nitrogen balance relate to an adult? You know, I just mentioned gut health and inflammation and cognitive function and muscle protein turnover. Nitrogen balance doesn't measure any of those things.
Um, I mean, you had a lot of great points in there, but I think that like it's like, what are you not
Overwhelming?
getting? No, I think it's a great indication for a lot of people who are kind of like looking at, yeah, I know I should increase my protein intake, but I'd really like to limit my calories. And so I'm just going to, put in some of these bars and some of these shakes and like, whoop, bam, like I've hit my like protein goals. But really
Yeah,
sometimes when we're looking at overall nutrition and health, what are you not getting into your diet?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. That you know, I spent my entire life, 40 years, studying essential amino acid balance. And so I know a lot about it and I know how to deal with it. But the average consumer just finds it overwhelming. And so they'll see a lot of ads and things. I mean, if you look at a wheat cereal, for example, that says it has 4 or 6 grams of protein in it, the reality is based on bioavailability and the essential amino acid, you probably has less than half of that that's actually usable to you. And so, you know, there's a lot of marketing and food labeling out there that is very deceptive to the average consumer. Most plant proteins in a natural form, their bioavailability is probably not higher than 70%. Some of it's low as 50%. Almonds, for example, people talk about as a great protein. It's a great snack. It's a nice food, but its protein bioavailability is probably barely 50%. And so, you can't possibly to eat it. A comparison might be for to get your minimum RDA for protein from chicken breast would take about 3.5 ounces. That would be sort of in the neighborhood of uh, uh, you know, for anyway, that would be sort of a minimum. To do it with almonds would take nearly 300 almonds. I mean, you,
And then
you
you're
would,
gonna end up with a stomach ache.
yeah. I
Taking
mean,
in
that would be
300 almonds.
massive. I mean, that would be a massive amount of fiber to bring into your body. So, you know, you think about protein bars and some of these things, and people have to think about why they're using it. Is a protein bar in the middle of the afternoon better than having a donut? Absolutely. you know, if you're doing protein, if you're a 50-year-old and you're thinking, well, I need protein. Uh, Now you have to think about amounts. So we know that the amount of protein that was actually going to help muscle health is probably in the 35-gram range. There's very few bars that get anywhere near that. So how are you using that bar? Is it a snack? Is it something you're adding on to a lunch that has 15 grams and now you add another 15? You really have to think about how you're using it. Is there something magic about having a protein bar after your workout? I would say it's a waste of money unless it makes you feel better.
Because they're very expensive too.
They're
Like
very
you
expensive.
get one
Yeah.
bar, it's like $4 or $5. Like,
Yeah.
and they don't
It's
have a
just,
guy.
yeah, I just, I am, like I said, I'm a big fan of whole foods. I don't use, very many bars. Maybe if I'm, traveling and I'm stuck on airplanes, I'll have one with me, which is more of a satiety issue than I believe it's helping my muscle mass. And, again, I'd rather have a protein bar than a donut. So, I think that's the correct way to think about it. Is eating a protein bar going to help your muscle mass and your physical appearance? I think it's a waste of money.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. So I know we talked about some supplementation a little bit and like what type of whey protein we can add into for shakes. So I do want to hit supplementation a little bit. The idea is whole foods for sure. But when it comes to supplements and we're looking at what types of protein to add into our diet, are there any ingredients we should be looking at to completely avoid? Is there anything that you can kind of tell the listeners that like when you're looking for a protein to add into your diet, like look for this thing?
Again, kind of crossing back and forth between all nutrients and and amino acids. Um, I think that if you look at the American diet, what we have seen in the last 40 years is that the amount of the micronutrients, iron and zinc, selenium, B6, B12, niacin, vitamin A, they have all gone down. So as we've shifted away, as we've had these dietary guidelines like Food Guide Pyramid that said eat less animal foods and eat more grains at the bottom, we've actually diluted the quality and nutrient density of the diet. So I'm a big fan of again whole foods and animal foods because the nutrient density that goes with them tends to be very good. When you go to plant proteins, now you have to think about how you're going to supplement that because the plant proteins, one, the vitamins and minerals there aren't in the same form. They're not in the same bioactive form. So you'll tend to need more of them. They're not as easily absorbed, so you tend to eat more of them. So how you balance that becomes a bigger challenge. And not to say you can't do it, but the average American doesn't have the food skills or the food knowledge to pull that off well. And so what we've seen is that the last 40 years is the quantity of the American diet has gone down. Obesity, diabetes are signs of we're eating more and more calories, getting fewer and fewer nutrients. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to course correct is that we need, especially when you put that in the framework that we tend to be more sedentary as a population. Um, we can correct a lot of things by having a lot more exercise. If you do a lot more exercise, that alone, that's probably the most important thing you can do for your muscle health. And that allows you to eat more. And if you simply can eat more, that allows you to get more nutrients. So now what we have is sedentary people who are eating too much and getting nutrient poor diets. So we've got the worst of all worlds.
Yeah, it's it's a conundrum we found ourselves in, isn't it? um, so I did want to.
I'll say if I could back up to one of the other comments about plant and animal proteins.
Yeah.
Your one of your early questions was um, how much protein should we have? I think one of the dilemmas then is that when people shift to more plant-based diets, they also tend to reduce the quantity of protein they're eating.
Yeah.
So what we know is that the average vegetarian intake for protein is around 60 to 65 grams per day. So now you've decreased the quality, by going to the plant-based. So you have fewer essential amino acids, plus you're eating less protein. So, when I talk to vegetarians, I think, okay, if you're going to be vegetarian, you've got to aim at around 1.2 grams per kg. You've got to get up above 100 grams per day to be sure you're getting essential amino acids. So, it's not that that's not a healthy way to go, but the way people implement it, it's not healthy. Low protein diet with low protein quality is asking for trouble.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost been marketed. I mean, the vegetarian or a vegan lifestyle has almost been marketed as superior to, in a healthy lifestyle and a superior diet. So, in your opinion, would you say that that doesn't hold true when it comes to protein?
Um, Absolutely, it doesn't. If you're low protein. Okay, so if you're eating 120 grams per day of protein, it probably doesn't matter much. You'll get enough essential amino acids. But if you're eating 60, it does matter. And so I think that's important. And the whole plant-based diet, I think we need to back up and think about that a bit. The plant-based diet right now, 80 to 90% of Americans are not eating the recommended vegetables and fruits. Uh,
That's a
and
really high
95%, yeah,
number.
but 95% of Americans are eating too many refined grains, and 65% are eating too many total grains. So we already have 70% of our calories come from plants now in the diet, but they're coming from really crappy foods. They're coming from ultra processed grains and seed oils and added sugar. So, I always say, we don't really need a more plant-based diet. We need a diet with better plants. It's sort of like, a plant-based diet doesn't mean you need more French fries. It means you need more broccoli.
Yeah. We can fix that quite as simply. Um,
Yeah.
so
And so
I,
people confuse that with the protein question. And, the question is a good plant-based diet. We should all probably have a better plant-based diet, but that doesn't mean we should be eating more wheat.
yep, yep.
Happy summer. Happy summer. Happy summer.
Honestly, the best thing about summer is the summer colors and the sunshine, but
The sunshine brings the summer colors, and we brought it this year for sure. You guys love slouchy tees. Like, you live in them.
why wouldn't you? Have you ever touched them?
So soft, so comfy, put together, but like just totally loungewear. Slouchy tees are coming out in new colors, and they are summer ready, girls.
Summer ready, but they also are coming with some summer bras. So we are not limiting you to having to wear a shirt this summer. Take it off, show off your summer colored bra, and get ready for this amazing weather.
New slouchy tees with matching summer bras. Go get them right now.
Now, I did want to ask too, about some of the amino acids and just, I mean, you're one of the leading experts when it comes to protein and amino acid requirements. So, when it comes to protein absorption, should we be thinking about some supplementing certain amino acids?
Not usually. Generally, there's a lot of amino acid supplements out there. Again, I think those are generally a waste of money. So you really have to ask why you're doing it. Um, we've done some work with amino acid supplementation, for example, in individuals who are at bed rest or in cases where they can't eat a lot of protein. We know that getting in 3 grams of leucine is important for muscle protein synthesis. So if you have a diet you're only able to eat 12 or 15 grams of protein, which probably will only get you a 1 or 1.5 grams of leucine, you can supplement the leucine and get the effect out of it. Um, you know, there might be reasons to supplement something like tryptophan for sleep or mood or something like that. Um, in general, it's better to try and eat the balance of protein, from whole foods. That way, the body is digesting it. They're coming in the same forms that they ought to come in, and things like that. So, I'm not a big fan of supplementation. I think there may be some reasons. There may be some reasons that um, glutamine is important for gut health, or that arginine is useful for blood pressure. But you really have to have a lot of knowledge to make those decisions. So, in general, I think the average person, there's no reason to get into thinking about amino acid supplementation.
Yeah. I think that the marketing's been really strong on this. So a lot of people have been hit with, you don't have enough, whoever is, in the limelight at the moment. You don't have enough
Yeah,
B12, everyone's going to get B12. You don't have enough of this. So everyone's starting to supplement anything without having any real knowledge base behind what they actually are deficient in and may
yeah,
or may not need supplementation.
yeah. And I think that's really hard to sort through, and I think it's very hard for individuals to sort through it. I'm a huge fan of having a varied diet, eating all the different food groups. I think that's the best assurance we have. Even if we, even if we know something about B12, what's the ideal level of anthocyanins in the diet? How many blueberries should you really eat? There's just so much about food that we don't really know. To think that you can get it in a bar or a pill, that's just really naive. There's just hundreds of compounds in foods that all have effects that we don't understand, and it'll be years, maybe never, before we really understand that. So there's no substitute to eating good food.
Yeah. What do you think is the biggest mistake people make when they look at adding more protein into their diet? Because I know a lot of people are going to leave this podcast and they say, like, I understand that I need to eat, I need to include more protein in my diet. I'm thinking, okay, the first meal of the day is kind of the most important. But what's the biggest mistake that people are making?
That's a great question. I don't usually get asked that one. People ask me about, is there too much protein? Biggest mistake for adding it. Um, I think probably the mistake with guys would be the belief that going from a 8-ounce steak to a 16-ounce steak will give them bigger muscles. I There's no real relationship that once you get. We think the sweet spot for protein at a meal is probably from a minimum of maybe 25 grams of high quality protein up to maybe 60, 65, kind of depending on your body size. And so people who go out and eat really big meals is a waste. It's a waste of calories. It's a waste of protein. So, I think uh, people probably make the mistake that they're either too low at a meal or they're too high at a meal. I think that's probably uh, the biggest mistake I would say people are making.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great answer. It also seems like there's a lot of conflicting information right now in the health and wellness space, um, and in the research community as well. What are your thoughts on this in general? And is there a way that, just as general consumers, we can kind of sift through all the information out there to kind of get the best, like, to really what's important to us and what should we be paying attention to?
There's certainly a lot of misinformation out there, and I think it's important to recognize that the news media loves headlines that imply it's going to kill you. If something isn't going to kill you, it doesn't make a good headline. So the media loves epidemiology that says red meat's going to kill you, or protein's going to kill you,
Or the new oil
or
is
or the new, whatever. They love those headlines. Um, my feeling is try not to pay much attention to those. As a researcher, I pay no attention to it. My approach to science is that anytime there's a new finding, I say, well, that's interesting. And when I see it in two more different laboratories, I begin to pay attention to it. Um, so I never overreact. I mean, we've been eating for millions of years, and the idea that somebody just discovered something yesterday that's going to make us live forever is simply stupid. Uh, that's just simply not the case. And the other issue is epidemiology. The news media is pretty dumb, frankly. Don't really understand science, but they love epidemiology, which says, well, red meat has shown that it correlates with diabetes. Um, well, the next question is, so what mechanism is that? Well, there's no mechanism. What RCTs, what random control studies show that? Well, there are none. What animal studies back? Well, there are none. So, epidemiology starts out with really crappy food data and then tries to make a conclusion 20 years later about health. I don't eat the same 2 days in a row ever. And so, I think probably the single worst thing that ever happened to the field of nutrition was applying epidemiology to it and assuming that means something. And that's what's really wrong with the dietary guidelines right now is that they're using big survey data because they have a lot of people in them to make conclusions. And it has been totally misguiding where we're at. I mean, we had a guidelines about low cholesterol based on really bad epidemiology that was with us for 40 years when in fact it was totally false. I was actually director of research at the American Egg Board when we finally got it out of the dietary guidelines. It was a totally false claim based on really bad epidemiology. One of the ones that bothers me the most is this thinking about LDL and quote bad cholesterol and heart disease. Um, we've just sort of extrapolated that down to the idea that having no LDL in your blood is somehow healthy. We know that having really high LDL is a health risk. Above 160 milligrams per deciliter, that's less than 10% of the population. And yet we have created dietary guidelines really driven by, oh, you need low saturated fat. It should be less than 10% of your calories. That's based on nothing. That was simply throwing darts at a wall and it happened to hit 10%. There's no science to back that up. And sort of the stupidity of that is that if we take an athlete with 4,000 calories per day as the normal, that 10% means that that person could have 44 grams of saturated fat and be healthy. But if we take an elderly person who's only able to eat 1,400 calories per day, that person's unhealthy at 16 grams per day. So one's okay at 44 and the other's unhealthy at 16. I'm a biochemist. There's no biochemical logic you can bring to that makes that make sense. And so that's just stupidity that we're using a number like that has no justification.
Dr. Layman, what is one thing that's top of mind for you right now and you wish people knew more about when it comes to nutrition or how to live a healthy lifestyle?
I think what I would like to see, I guess, would be two things. One is I would like to see people stop demonizing animal foods. I think that they are very high nutritional value. I'm particularly concerned about how it gets applied to children, that we're bringing these kinds of very poor diets, snack food oriented diets to children when they really need higher satiety protein sources. And the other is somehow we have to figure out for people to get healthier plants, whether that's more beans or brown rice or whether it's broccoli and green beans. People aren't eating enough healthy plant orientation. So we need to we need to figure out how to get these ultra processed foods out of our diet that the food industry loves to sell because they make a lot of profit, but the nutritional value and the excess calories are really killing us. And so, I think that message is getting out there, but people have to start with the idea that when they design their diet, it's the first thing they have to do is design it around a protein choice. And if you make a protein choice, whether you're vegetarian or an omnivore, that determines a lot of other things about your lifestyle. If you're a vegetarian, you're going to have to be very conscious of your essential amino acids. you better be involved in exercise to protect your muscles. If you have a higher protein diet, that's another decision. How do you balance it? But we've been sort of taught for years that you start with what you avoid fat. Oh, well, you need to start with a protein centric, muscle centric idea of how do I keep my muscles healthy? And that starts with a protein decision. And once you make that decision, then everything else has to line up. You have to consider your age, your physical activity, the kind of protein you're eating. All of those things have to fall in line. And so, I think that would be the biggest change is I think the idea that people are protein centric now, more thinking about it, I think that's a great step forward.
It's been amazing talking to you today. I know our listeners are going to want to hear more from you. Where can they find you?
That's a great question. I'm somewhat invisible. I'm a little bit on Twitter, so at Don Layman. Uh, my good friend and my best friend and colleague is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and so she and I have a lot of podcasts out together. So that's another place that you can find us. But yeah, I'm not quite as involved in social media as other people.
Dr. Layman, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on with us today. You were extremely insightful, and we really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of your knowledge about protein today.
My pleasure to join you.